Diego Martinez answered the phone thinking it was the hospital calling about his sick son. Instead, it was a wrong number, a woman alone, terrified, dying in a hospital bed with no one by her side. He went anyway. He walked into the room and saw Carmen Velasquez, the richest heiress in Spain, pale and fragile, surrounded by machines keeping her alive. She opened her eyes, saw a stranger who had come in the middle of the night just because he'd heard fear in her voice, and whispered something that would change both their lives. She asked him to stay just for that night. She didn't want to die alone. Diego took her hand without knowing who she was, without knowing that this woman owned half of Madrid, without knowing that this simple act of kindness toward a stranger would pull him into a world of luxury, betrayal, and a love neither of them was looking for, but both desperately needed. Diego Martinez was 38 years old, had a 6-year-old son named Lucas, and a life built on daily sacrifices. He'd been a widower for 2 years, ever since his wife Isabel had died of cancer, leaving him with a young child and a mortgage to pay. He worked as a nurse at La Paz University Hospital, covering exhausting shifts to earn enough to give Lucas everything he needed. That January night, he'd finished his shift at 11 p.m. He'd come home exhausted, checked that Lucas was sleeping peacefully in his room, and had fallen asleep on the couch, still in his uniform. The phone rang at 2 a.m., jolting him from a deep sleep. His heart exploded in his chest. Calls at that hour only ever meant emergencies. Lucas had asthma. He'd been in the hospital 3 times in the last 6 months. Every nighttime ring was pure terror. He grabbed the phone, seeing an unknown number. He answered, his voice tense, bracing for terrible news. Instead, he heard a woman's voice, weak, trembling, asking if this was Dr. Velasquez. Diego, confused, replied that she had the wrong number. Silence on the other end. Then the voice, even weaker, apologized. She was about to hang up when Diego heard something in her tone that stopped him. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear. Fear of dying. He asked if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman said, her voice breaking, that she wasn't okay. She apologized for bothering him. But Diego had been a nurse for 15 years. He knew the sound of someone who was far from okay. He insisted, asking where she was. After a hesitation, the woman admitted she was in the ICU at San Carlos Clinical Hospital. She'd tried to call her brother, but she must have dialed wrong. It didn't matter, he wouldn't have come anyway. Something in those words broke something inside Diego. A person alone, in the ICU, with no one, not even a family member willing to come. He asked for her name and room number. The woman, surprised by the question, said her name was Carmen. Room 307. Diego told her to wait. He would come. Carmen protested weakly, saying it wasn't necessary, she didn't even know him. But Diego had already decided. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes, and not to hang up if she needed help before then. He quickly called Mrs. Rosa, the elderly neighbor who often watched Lucas, and explained the emergency. She arrived in 5 minutes in her robe. She shooed him out with a reassuring gesture. Diego drove through the empty streets of Madrid, feeling something he hadn't felt in 2 years, a purpose. The purpose of helping someone who truly needed it. At San Carlos Clinical Hospital, the city's most luxurious, he showed his nursing credentials and said he was there to visit a patient. The night nurse, tired and too busy to ask questions, let him through. Room 307 was at the end of the hall. Diego knocked softly before entering. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of medical machines. In the bed lay a woman around 35, and even pale and fragile, she was beautiful. Chestnut hair spread on the pillow, large eyes looking at him with surprise and gratitude as he entered. Carmen looked at him in disbelief, whispering that he'd actually come. A stranger had driven across Madrid in the middle of the night for someone he didn't know. Diego approached the bed with a kind smile, saying he'd told her he would come, and asked how she was feeling. Carmen tried to smile, but it was clear how weak she was. In a faint voice, she explained she'd been in a car accident 3 days ago. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding. She'd had 2 surgeries. The doctors said she'd survive, but tonight, she'd been afraid of falling asleep and not waking up. And there was no one. No family, no friends. Just her and the machines keeping her alive. Diego pulled a chair up to the bed. He told her she wasn't alone now, that he'd stay until she fell asleep or until they kicked him out, whichever came first. Carmen laughed weakly, and then the tears started to fall. She whispered thank you with a sincerity that hurt. They talked for hours. Carmen shared little about herself at first, instead asking about him. Diego talked about Lucas, how he was his whole world, how every day was a challenge but also a gift. He talked about Isabel, how she'd been strong until the end, how she'd made him promise he would live, not just survive. Then Carmen began to talk, not about her accident, but about her life. About how she felt alone in the middle of hundreds of people. About how her family was only interested in the money she'd inherit from her father, who had died 6 months earlier. About how her boyfriend had left her 2 weeks before the accident, saying she was too cold, too closed off. About how maybe he was right. Diego listened without judgment, then said softly that she didn't seem cold to him. She seemed lonely. And that was a huge difference. Carmen looked at him, her eyes filling with tears again. No one had ever said anything so kind, so true. At 5 a.m., Carmen finally surrendered to exhaustion. Before falling asleep, she held Diego's hand tightly, whispering something that would stay with him for days. She asked if he could come back. He didn't have to, not if it was a problem, but if he could, she would like it. Diego gently squeezed her hand, promising he would return. The next day, after work, Carmen smiled, finally falling asleep with a serene expression she hadn't had in days. Diego stayed another 10 minutes, making sure her breathing was regular. Then he slipped out silently. Alone in the parking lot, walking back to his car as dawn painted Madrid pink, Diego realized he hadn't asked her last name. He knew nothing about her beyond that name, Carmen. But he knew she was alone. And he knew he would come back. Diego returned to the hospital the next night with a book he thought she might like and a thermos of homemade hot chocolate. The evening shift nurse was more alert this time, asking who he was. Diego was about to make up an excuse when an authoritative voice interrupted. A man around 50, wearing an expensive suit, approached with a suspicious expression. He introduced himself as Dr. Ramirez, head of the department. He asked what Diego was doing there. Diego explained he was a friend of the patient, here to visit. The doctor looked him over, scrutinizing every detail. Then he said something that surprised Diego. He said that Miss Velasquez had had no visitors apart from her lawyers. No friends, no family. If Diego really was her friend, he would be the first. The tone was skeptical, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like hope, as if the doctor wanted to believe that this lonely woman finally had someone. Diego nodded, saying yes, he was her friend. The doctor studied him a moment longer, then gestured that he could go in. But first, in a lower voice, he said something. He said Diego might not know who Carmen Velasquez was, but if he was there for money, to take advantage of a vulnerable woman, he would personally call security. Diego looked him directly in the eye and replied that he didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know who Carmen was beyond the fact that she was alone and needed a friend. He didn't want money, he didn't want anything except to make sure she was okay. The doctor seemed surprised by the sincerity, then nodded, letting him pass with a softer expression. When Diego entered room 307, Carmen was sitting up in bed, much more alert than the night before. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. She said, her voice stronger, that he'd actually come back. She seemed unable to believe it. Diego smiled, saying he'd promised, and he'd brought hot chocolate. They spent the afternoon talking. Carmen seemed different, more open, more present. She asked about Lucas, wanted to see photos, laughed at the funny stories Diego told. Then, as the sun set and the room filled with shadows, Carmen became more serious. She said she had to tell him something that would probably change the way he saw her. Diego waited patiently. Carmen took a deep breath and said her full name. Carmen Velázquez. Daughter of Antonio Velázquez, founder of Velázquez Industries, Spain's largest industrial conglomerate. Heiress to an estate estimated at €2 billion. One of the richest women in the country. Diego was silent for a long moment, processing the information. Then he said the only thing that came to mind. That explained the fancy room. Carmen laughed, surprised by the reaction. She asked if this changed things, if he saw her differently now. Diego answered honestly. Yes, it changed things. Now he understood why she was so alone, why the doctor was so protective, why she seemed so surprised that someone would visit her without wanting something. But it didn't change the fact that that night, he'd heard fear in her voice. It didn't change the fact that she was a person who needed a friend. And money didn't make loneliness any less painful. Carmen felt the tears fall. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Everyone saw the money before they saw her. Everyone wanted something. But Diego had come even before knowing who she was. He'd come because he'd heard fear in the voice of a stranger. That said more about him than anything else. Diego took her hand, saying the money didn't define her. She was defined by how she treated people, by what was in her heart. And he saw someone kind, someone who deserved to be surrounded by people who loved her for who she was, not for what she owned. Carmen squeezed his hand, confessing something. She said her brother Javier hadn't come, not because he had the wrong number. He'd ignored her calls deliberately. They were at war over their father's inheritance. Javier wanted it all. He thought she didn't deserve anything because she was a woman, because she had no interest in the family business. Her boyfriend had left her when he found out she was donating half her inheritance to charitable foundations instead of investing it. She was alone because she'd made choices the people around her disapproved of, choices to live by her values, instead of by their expectations. And now, in a hospital bed, she wondered if those choices had been wrong. If being alone was the price of her integrity. Diego said firmly that no, they weren't wrong. That being temporarily alone for staying true to herself was better than being surrounded by people who only loved her for what they could get. That she would find her tribe. People who appreciated her for who she was. And that until then, she had him. Not a rich or important friend, just a nurse with a son and a heart that understood what it meant to be alone. Carmen looked at him with something in her eyes that seemed like wonder. Then she asked something that surprised him. She asked him to bring Lucas. She wanted to meet the boy she'd heard so much about. Diego hesitated, saying he didn't want to impose, but Carmen insisted. She said children were honest, pure, and she would like to see the world through the eyes of someone who didn't know her as the heiress, but just as his dad's friend. 2 days later, Diego brought Lucas to the hospital. The boy was curious and a little nervous. He held his father's hand tightly as they walked down the hall. Diego had explained they were visiting a sick friend of his who needed company. Lucas had nodded seriously, saying he wanted to help her feel better. When they entered the room, Carmen was sitting in a chair by the window, much more recovered. The bruises on her face were fading, color had returned to her cheeks. She saw Lucas and her face lit up. The boy hid behind his father's legs for a moment, then peeked out with curious eyes. Carmen slowly knelt down to his level, smiling. She asked him his name. Lucas answered shyly. Carmen told him she was happy to meet him, that his dad had told her so much about him, that he was a very brave boy. Lucas smiled at the compliment, coming out of his hiding place. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled a drawing out of his pocket that he'd made. It was a drawing of a big, bright sun with the words "So you get better soon" written in crooked letters. He held it out to Carmen with his small hands. Carmen took it, feeling her throat tighten. She looked at that simple drawing, made with colored markers, and felt something break and mend itself in her chest at the same time. She thanked Lucas, her voice trembling, telling him it was the most beautiful gift she'd ever received. Lucas smiled proudly. Then he asked if he could look out the window. Carmen nodded, and he ran to the window, starting to tell her everything he saw. The cars, the trees, a bird flying. Diego watched the scene, feeling something warm expand in his chest. Carmen listened to Lucas with genuine attention, asking questions, laughing at his funny observations. She wasn't faking interest. She was genuinely fascinated by this 6-year-old and his way of seeing the world. After an hour, Lucas started to get tired. Carmen told him he could rest on the sofa if he wanted. Lucas went, taking his bag with coloring books. As he colored quietly, Diego and Carmen talked in low voices. Carmen said something that surprised him. She said she wanted to leave that hospital, not just physically, but her whole life. She wanted to start over. She was thinking of leaving Madrid, going somewhere where no one knew her as the Velázquez heiress, where she could just be Carmen. Diego asked what was stopping her. Carmen answered, fear. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of being even more alone in a new place, fear of discovering that it wasn't the situation that was the problem, but her. Diego said softly that he understood that fear. After Isabel died, he'd been afraid to do anything, afraid to move, to change, to live. But then he'd looked at Lucas and realized he couldn't teach him to be afraid. He had to teach him courage, even when it was terrifying. Carmen nodded slowly. Then she asked something bold. She asked if he would want to go with her. Not romantically, she clarified quickly, but as friends. She needed to start over, and he worked so hard just to survive. She could offer him a better life for Lucas, a bigger house, better schools, no more exhausting shifts. In return, she would have a friend. Someone who saw her for who she was. Diego was stunned by the offer. It was too much, he couldn't accept. But Carmen insisted. She said it wasn't charity, it was a partnership. She had money, but she was alone. He had family, but struggled financially. Together they could help each other. Lucas would have a mother figure. She would have people who cared about her, not her money. Diego said he needed time to think. It was a huge change, but he promised to think about it seriously. Carmen nodded, accepting. Then they both looked at Lucas, who had fallen asleep on the sofa, marker still in his hand, and shared a smile. A week later, Carmen was discharged from the hospital. Diego came to pick her up in his old seat, a stark contrast to the limousines that usually transported her. Carmen smiled when she saw the car, saying it was perfect. She got in with some difficulty, her still healing ribs making her move slowly. Diego took her to the small apartment where he lived with Lucas. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, second-hand furniture. He was embarrassed showing her how modest it was, but Carmen stopped him. She said it was beautiful because it was a home, not just 4 walls. You could feel the love in every corner. Lucas came running when he heard the door, stopping short when he saw Carmen. Then he ran to hug her carefully, remembering she still hurt. Carmen laughed, hugging him gently, telling him she was so happy to see him. That evening, they had dinner together. Pasta with tomato sauce, made by Diego, simple, but delicious. Lucas chatted animatedly about his day at school. Carmen listened, fascinated, asking questions. Diego watched the scene, feeling something he hadn't felt in 2 years, a sense of family. After dinner, while Lucas was bathing, Carmen and Diego talked. Diego said he'd thought about her offer. He'd talked to Lucas, explaining it in terms a child could understand. He'd asked him how he'd feel about having Carmen in their lives, moving to a new house, starting a new adventure. Lucas had said seriously that he liked Carmen, and if Dad was happy, he was happy. Diego looked Carmen in the eye, saying his answer was yes, but with conditions. He didn't want to be kept, he wanted to work, to contribute. Maybe not with money at the same level, but he wanted to earn his place. And if at any point she changed her mind, if she wanted her life back, he would leave without resentment. Carmen nodded at the conditions, her eyes bright. She said she already had a proposal. She'd bought a villa in Andalusia, a remote place in the hills. She needed someone to manage the property. Diego could work there, help her transform it into something. And for Lucas, there was an excellent school in the nearby village. Diego said it sounded like a dream. Carmen replied that maybe it was a dream for both of them. A chance to start over. 3 months later, the Andalusian villa was transformed. Diego had worked hard restoring the gardens, repairing the old fountain, turning the neglected property into something beautiful. Carmen helped when she could, though Diego always protested that she should rest, but she insisted. She wanted to be part of this transformation. Lucas was thriving. He liked his new school, had made friends, ran through the fields with a freedom he'd never had in the city, and had developed a strong bond with Carmen. He simply called her Carmen, not Aunt or any other title, but the way he said it was full of affection. Evenings had become everyone's favorite time. Dinners together in the big, rustic kitchen. Conversations that lasted for hours. Laughter that filled the house. Carmen had started painting again, a passion she'd abandoned years ago. Diego encouraged her to pursue it. One night, 6 months after the move, Carmen confessed something. She said she was happier than she'd been in years, maybe ever. She didn't need the galas, the board meetings, the life she'd built in Madrid. She needed this: simplicity, connection, genuine love. Diego listened. Then he said something that had been in his heart for months. He said he was happy too, happier than he thought possible after Isabel. And if he was honest, his feelings for Carmen had changed. It wasn't just friendship anymore, it was something deeper. Carmen felt her heart race. She confessed she felt the same, but she was afraid. Afraid of ruining what they had. Afraid that if they tried and failed, they'd lose everything. Diego said softly that he understood that fear. But he'd learned something from Isabel's death: regretting things left unsaid, chances not taken, hurt more than trying and failing. They kissed that night, softly, under the Andalusian stars. And when they parted, they both knew this was the beginning of something beautiful. A year later, the villa had become not just a home, but a refuge. Carmen had started a foundation helping women in difficulty, giving them a place to rebuild their lives. Diego managed the property and helped with the foundation, using his medical experience to provide support. Lucas was 8 now, happy and secure, with 2 parents who loved him, because Carmen had become that. Not legally yet, but in all their hearts. One evening, after putting Lucas to bed, Diego led Carmen to the restored garden. By the fountain that now flowed with life, he knelt down, took out a simple ring, and said something that came from the bottom of his heart. He said he'd answered a wrong number a year ago, thinking it was an emergency. And in a way, it was. 2 people alone, lost, desperately needing connection. That wrong number had been the most right thing that ever happened to him. It had given him not just a partner, but a family. And he wanted it to last forever. He asked her to marry him. Carmen cried, saying yes. Not for the money, not for security, but because she had found something she'd been searching for her whole life without knowing it. A man who saw her. A child who loved her. A family built not on blood or duty, but on the daily choice to be together. 6 months later, they were married in the small village church. Nothing fancy. Just close friends and the community that had welcomed them. Lucas was the ring bearer, proud and serious. And when Diego kissed Carmen, when they were pronounced husband and wife, they both knew they had found their forever. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Built on honesty, respect, and the love that is born when you truly see someone and choose to stay, every single day. Like this video if you believe that sometimes, wrong numbers lead us exactly where we need to be. Comment if you've also found something beautiful in an unexpected moment. Share this story to remind others that kindness to strangers can change lives. Subscribe for more stories that prove true wealth isn't measured in money, but in authentic human connections. Sometimes a wrong number is the right one. Sometimes going toward an emergency that isn't yours takes you exactly where you need to be. Diego went to that hospital to help a dying stranger. But who was really saved? Carmen from being alone, or Diego from merely existing without truly living? Maybe both. Because sometimes, saving another person is the only way to save yourself. And sometimes, the strongest families aren't the ones created by blood, but the ones chosen by the heart. One call at a time. One kindness at a time. One day at a time.